Right now, search and recovery efforts are still underway in the icy Potomac River behind me for the bodies of about 30 of the crash victims still in the wreckage. As Blake talked about, black boxes have been recovered from at least the plane, the American Airlines plane. So those will begin to be examined to understand what was happening in the cockpit of the American Airlines jet. The water is cold. There is rain on the way. There is still ice on the river. So that cold and dangerous and miserable job for rescuers is about to get a whole lot worse, both as they try to recover the helicopter and the plane. In an immediate reaction to the crash, President Trump today signed a flurry of executive actions to change aviation in America. He also blamed the Biden and Obama administration for prioritizing DEI in hiring air traffic controllers.
Incompetence might have played a role. We'll let you know that. But we want the most competent people. We don't care what race they are. We want the most competent people, especially in those positions.
And we are learning that at least one issue that they were dealing with last night was staffing. There was one air traffic controller handling both aircraft and helicopters at Reagan Airport at 9 o'clock. Normally there are two. The crash happened just down the river from where I am standing right now. The aircraft, the helicopter, and the plane ran into each other on a clear night, about like now. You can see forever in the most controlled and protected airspace in America. And tonight we can say with certainty that this crash was entirely preventable. That's our Why It Matters segment tonight. As aviation folks would say, human factors had to play a major role in this. In other words, someone or multiple someones screwed up. As hard as that is to say, we need to say it, as the president alluded to.
If they're in the right locations and if they're not at the same levels, I mean, if a plane coming in is at 300 feet or 400 feet and a helicopter's training at 300 or 400 feet, why wouldn't they be up 500 feet higher?
Trump also went on a long rant about DEI programs in the FAA. We're going to take a deeper dive into the president's claims a little later on. Plus, Democrats trashed Trump's Secretary of Defense and Secretary of Transportation as incompetent picks. They've only been on the job a couple days. We're going to give a fair assessment of how they are handling the first crisis of this administration. But what really matters now is figuring out what happened, how it happened, how to prevent it from happening again. Is it safe to fly? We owe the people who died the answers to those questions. A man who was waiting at the airport last night to pick up his wife joins us in a few minutes. And we're going to talk about how to talk to your kids about flying. Flying is one of the safest things to do in America. Hasn't been a major crash since 2009. And the truth is, for planes to crash, for them to run into each other midair, multiple things have to go wrong. Last night was clear and it was cold. So to really understand how this happened, we wanted to show you what happened from where I am standing overlooking where the helicopter flew and Reagan Airport, but during the day. Planes have started to take off and land at Reagan. It's impossible to underscore how tight the airspace is. Where I'm standing is where the helicopter flew down. This is what's known as Route 4, runs basically from up by where the Lincoln Memorial is, down the Potomac, and then over this little waterway. So the Black Hawk helicopter, about 90 seconds before it crashed, flew right over this yacht, headed down, and then at the end of this island at Haynes Point is where the Potomac meets up. Route 4, the helicopters are supposed to be at 200 feet, and the altitude of this helicopter is going to be a defining part of this accident. This is a picture I took standing right about here from inside my apartment of one of the helicopters flying Route 4 going south just a couple of days ago. In this case, it was one of the helicopters that's used for Marine One by the president. So the helicopter that was flying last night was doing a training mission, practicing what's called continuity of government. So every night, every day, helicopters fly this route, going back and forth, practicing what an evacuation of the White House would look like. And again, you see where this area for the helicopters is, and then you see the Southwest plane landing just over there. That's how tight the airspace is. So the Black Hawk helicopter flying down Route 4. Last night, the planes were landing coming up the Potomac River into Reagan Airport, and we heard the radio calls.
S25, CRJ in flight. S25, on is CRJ. This club has a aircraft in flight for separation. Separation. 472 Washington Star, 1 star, 32017.
At that moment of the radio call, with the tower asking the helicopter, can you see the American Airlines plane, the helicopter would have been turning right here, heading down the Potomac. It should have been at 200 feet. It was an awful lot higher. At that same time, the plane, which was coming up the Potomac, so they were flying from the south over the Eisenhower Bridge and coming up, had been asked to change its runway from runway 19, the normal landing runway, to one of the intersecting runways, runway 33. That is when, as the plane came over the Potomac, it intersected with the flight path of Route 4. Shouldn't have been a problem. Plane at 350 feet, helicopter was supposed to be at 200 feet. The helicopter was not at 200 feet, it was at 350 feet, and that flash of light you see was basically about a half a mile south of where this island ends, and the main part of the Potomac takes over.
Crash, crash, crash. This is Alert 3. Crash, crash, crash. This is Alert 3. Crash, crash, crash. This is Alert 3. 2 helicopters. Helicopter CRJ approaching runway 33.
Just a minute, we're going to get a perspective from one of the most experienced pilots in the world, who has both flown Black Hawks and other helicopters down this route and then has flown commercial and large aircraft into Reagan Airport. It's the kind of perspective that you need to understand what both pilots were thinking to understand what went wrong. But we start tonight with NewsNation senior national correspondent who is on the other side of the Potomac. Give us an update here on the recovery efforts with Brian Entin. Hi, Brian.
Hi, Leland. Yeah, in terms of recovery, things have really slowed down behind me tonight. It's cold. It's very, very dark. There was a lot of action throughout the day. We're told that they were able to recover about 30 bodies or so, and they will continue tomorrow. But tonight there is basically just one police boat behind me out in the dark river guarding the wreckage, but we haven't seen the recovery efforts continue tonight or the divers in the water. In terms of what went wrong, the NTSB being very careful today not to jump to any conclusions. President Trump, though, and the defense secretary being clear that the pilots of the American Airlines jet did nothing wrong. They were on track to land there on runway 33. And they were just about to land when the helicopter slammed right into them. Why didn't the helicopter pilots see them with their night vision goggles? That's a big question. And what was going on in the control tower? The reports that there was only one controller working, Leland, when there was supposed to be two. There's supposed to be one controller just watching out for the helicopters, and there's supposed to be one controller just watching out for the planes, because this area is so busy, as you said. Why was there just one controller working? And finally, Leland, I want to touch on the Washington Post reporting tonight that just 24 hours before this crash, there was another American Airlines plane that had to do a go-around. It was almost exactly 24 hours earlier because a helicopter was in the way. They had to go around. I was just looking at the flight records. We were able to also confirm that. The big question the night before, Wednesday night, was there also just one controller working then? Did they not have the required two controllers? Have they been putting people at risk for days? All of that now under investigation, Leland.
Yeah, there really is so many questions here and always so many factors that go into this. Brian, thank you. Bring in Chris Bauer, co-chair of the U.S. Helicopter Safety Team. Uniquely rated, has flown Army helicopters, U.S. Coast Guard helicopters, Air Force, fixed wing as well. Right now flying everything from the 787 Dreamliner, 2 helicopters, has a lot of experience in this airspace. Start with this, and thank you for being here. The idea that there was only one controller, what does that mean practically for the pilots in the air?
Well, Leland, first of all, thanks for having me this evening. Well, you've increased the amount of workload. It'd be like flying single pilot. you're going to have to do the job of more than one person at the same time. I think the other factor to look at here, and I'm not here to second guess or look to blame anybody. I'm just looking at the system itself. The system itself, you could have airliners, you can have the tower, approach control, all those aircraft on a VHF frequency. Then you have a military aircraft that is on a UHF frequency, different frequency spectrum, different channel, if you will. And the one controller is working both frequencies, and the airline pilots who are on VHF cannot hear what's going on with that military aircraft. And a great thing about situational awareness, so you had a last-minute runway change for the pilots that were landing on runway 33, and you've got the military helicopter on a different frequency. They may not have heard any of that exchange. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but
it's a great. It makes perfect sense, and it's a great point. At least some of the recordings have both the American flight and the Army helicopter on them, which I think you make this great point about situational awareness, though, and what is happening. How easy is it? And you've flown this route right down here. How easy is it to get disoriented of lights of planes coming in stacked up down by the Eisenhower Bridge, the bridge lights, the surface lights, to really differentiate that? And what do you make of the fact that as the helicopter came down here, it made this sort of very unusual turn out to the right, over Haines Point, over land where it should not have been, and then continued down?
Well, I can't speak to what was going on in the cockpit at that point, because obviously neither one of us were there. But what I would say, from having flown the H-60 and flown on goggles, and have flown on goggles at night in New York City, I've flown in Washington, flying on goggles in an urban area, there's a lot of cultural lighting. And it's very difficult sometimes to distinguish objects when you have a lot of lights, because all the lights are the same color.
Yep.
Also, in the 60s,
that's a great point.
In particular, is visibility.
I want to just get in one. Yeah. So this is file footage of what pilots are seeing in goggles.
So it's very difficult.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense.
That are above you. And when I flew it, you almost had to contort your body to see objects that were above you, to discern them. And now you're doing it with goggles. So I think it's very challenging for those pilots to have been able to possibly see flying goggles in that area. And when you look at Route 1 and you look at Route 4 and where they come together at Haines Point, if you have traffic that is in that area, it's almost like you have a transgression zone between dissimilar traffic operating on different trajectories on different frequencies. And the military aircraft may or may not have TCAS, traffic collision avoidance system, on board to give them, the pilots, additional information. So it makes sense almost to look at how you could perhaps stop the flow of copter traffic when you have operations on the threshold of the runway.
Yeah, you're describing really the perfect storm, right? Multiple things going wrong. The traffic collision avoidance system on the regional jet goes into a different mode below 1,000 feet. All of these are great points. I think what we're getting at, though, the number one job of a pilot is to not run into other airplanes. You're trained from the very beginning of keeping your eyes out, especially if you're flying under visual flight rules, which the helicopter was and the aircraft was not. Something had to have been going wrong in the helicopter, right, for them to lose that situational awareness of where they were.
I wouldn't comment on that. I'm just looking at the system that they're operating in, where you have a route that runs in front of the threshold of a runway with dissimilar aircraft operating in that same airspace on different frequencies. And it creates a very high workload for everybody.
Fair enough. Chris, we really appreciate your time. Thank you very much, and your expertise as well. President Trump's press conference today set off a nationwide debate, not over airspace, not over pilot workloads, but over DEI hires at the FAA. We're going to tell you the truth about who is actually in the control tower and why it matters.
You know, you're talking about extremely complex things, and if they don't have a great brain, a great power of the brain, they're not going to be very good at what they do, and bad things will happen.
President Trump spoke earlier today and trashed the Federal Aviation Administration's DEI hiring practices. He didn't say they were specifically to blame for the crash. We don't know who was at fault here. But he said that DEI hiring practices go all the way back to 2013 and that they had to stop.
The FAA's diversity push includes focus on hiring people with severe intellectual and psychiatric disabilities. That is amazing. And then it says FAA says people with severe disabilities are most underrepresented segment of the workforce, and they want them in, and they want them. They can be air traffic controllers. I don't think so. This was in January 14th, so that was a week before I entered office. They put a big push to put diversity into the FAA's program.
He said that less than 20 hours after the crash. We're going to get into why he said it right now. There's an important reason for that. But he brings up a point. Maybe it wasn't the cause, but priorities matter when it comes to running government. And a reporter challenged him because there is no evidence right now that diversity had anything to do with this crash. He called his perspective common sense.
I'm trying to figure out how you can come to the conclusion right now that diversity had something to do with this crash.
Because I have common sense, okay? And unfortunately, a lot of people don't.
Randy Babbitt is with us now, 16th Federal Aviation Administrator, appointed by President Barack Obama. Good to see you, sir. Thank you. If we put aside for a second and stipulate that we have no idea whether diversity was involved here as it related to the air traffic controllers, does President Trump have a point that priorities matter? And during the Obama administration, and specifically during the Biden administration, there was so much discussion about the FAA as it related to everything but safety that they may have gotten away from their core mission.
Well, I don't believe that in the slightest amount. There's a lot of parts to the FAA, and I would take great exception to what the president said, that, anybody could be an air traffic controller. Quite the contrary. There's very strict requirements for air traffic control. It's a 2-year process. It's intensive. It's a lot of training. It's like being a pilot. In one sense, there's a lot of training goes involved, a lot of mentoring. And you don't just go from the end of your 2 years to the, Chicago O'Hare. No, you start at smaller, work your way up. So I would take great exception. And I would also note that there was 4 years between Obama and Biden when President Trump was president. So I don't know what action he took in there, but he certainly was in existence.
Well, he would tell you, sir, that he changed and brought out or ended the Obama era rules. And one of those rules was that priority was no longer given to military controllers. There were a number of people who had very high scores on the FAA entrance exam who were passed over, they claimed, for diversity issues. Mid-air collisions under Biden, 538 per year. Under Trump 1, average of 357 per year. These are the reported near mid-air collisions. 4 years after the Buffalo crash, average of 186 per year. So there's something going on, unquestionably, of near misses increasing. How is that not a problem?
Well, it would definitely be a problem, but we have better reporting today, and we also have a lot better avionics today than we had, so that they're reported more frequently. In the old days, you might have had a near miss, I call them. But you might not have even known it because you didn't see it. Maybe the airplane passed below you. Today we see so much more, and they get reported better. And we also take, very serious corrective action. Why did it happen? What went wrong? Was this simply, and how many of those are in VFR conditions where the two airplanes are uncontrolled, they're just flying, which is legal. You can do that.
Do you understand the feeling among so many Americans that they?
No, I completely agree with you, but there's different levels of hiring and what you're doing. Airlines hire a lot of people, but not all of them are going to be pilots. Important to remember. Diversity has nothing to do with it. They don't matter what color.
No. All right, fair enough. We appreciate the perspective, sir. Thank you very much. I think it's point well made. The last 24 hours, we have seen an enormous test of.
The FAA hires a lot of people, but not all of them can be controllers. They have very, very high standards to be an air traffic controller, and that's important.
A new administration. How did Donald Trump and his team measure up? There were a lot of questions about competency. A fair grade of the response to the worst aviation disaster in 15 years. Okay. Bring it a little closer. Welcome back. The last 24 hours can be considered the first test of the Trump administration. The first commercial airline disaster in America since 2009. This is a crisis not only involving the Department of Transportation, being the FAA, but the Department of Defense, because it was an Army helicopter. So nearly every aspect of this new administration has been put under an immediate spotlight. The weight of the situation, as it always does, sits on the president's shoulders, the commander-in-chief, also today, the comforter-in-chief.
I'd like to request a moment of silence for the victims and their families, please.
This accident underscores the need, of course, for really competent leadership. Serious people who know what they are doing to find the answers and to fix the problems. You'll remember the left roundly criticized Secretary of Defense Pete Buttigieg for lack of experience and poked fun at now Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy for his past work in reality TV. Here they are today.
Tragically, last night, a mistake was made. And I think the president is right. There was some sort of an elevation issue that we have immediately begun investigating at the DOD and Army level. Army CID is on the ground investigating. Top-tier aviation assets inside the DOD are investigating, sir, to get to the bottom of it so that it does not happen again, because it's absolutely unacceptable.
Safety is our expectation. Everyone who flies in American skies expects that we fly safely, that when you depart an airport, you get to your destination. That didn't happen last night. And I know that President Trump, his administration, the FAA, the DOT, we will not rest until we have answers.
With us now, Mark Halpern, host of Two-Way, author of Game Change and Double Down, one of the best political reporters, if not the best and most sourced in the country. Also, we have found on this program to be an incredibly fair arbiter of situations. How are they doing, Mark?
Well, I think from a communications point of view, they're doing excellent. Maybe not a surprise, a reality TV show star, Fox News journalist, a former reality TV star, Secretary of Transportation. I think just objectively you can say they were commanding. They made bold promises and assurances, and they were aggressive in coming out and saying we're in charge here. I think the proof will be if they actually deliver. If air travel becomes safer, of course, as you know, it actually is extraordinarily safe in the United States. But this accident, whatever its causes, needs to be rectified. And they said today they would do it. So if you're looking for Washington to say, we got this, we're new here, but we understand how to fix it, we're going for excellence, you heard him say it, but they've got to do it now.
I can't think of a president who in their first days was faced with such an unexpected crisis. Obviously, Barack Obama inherited the financial crisis, but that's different in terms of what needs to be discussed. Donald Trump has taken a lot of heat from the media over what you might call politicizing this. Here he is talking about controller competency. Take a listen.
All I'm talking about is competence. And we want in the In that particular position, we have to have the most competent people in our country because we're talking about lives. Now, it may or may not have had to do, but I don't like the fact that the helicopter was at the exact same level as the airplane.
And earlier, he had really trashed the Obama administration. The Biden administration called out Pete Buttigieg really aggressively about hiring practices at the FAA. I'm old enough, you're old enough to remember when you waited until the bodies were buried, and politicians then started waiting until they were out of the water, and now less than 20 hours. Be that as it may. Donald Trump does things for reasons, and I'm wondering if that there is not more to the strategy than him just deciding to go out there and say whatever he wants.
So I would divide Americans into three buckets, and I would tell you there's tens of millions in all three buckets. There are those who like what he said today. They think it's feisty. They think it's not like a normal politician. There are those who don't much care for it, but it doesn't impact their support for Donald Trump. And there are those who look at it as disgusting. And again, there are tens of millions in all groups. You and I have friends in all three groups. His provocative nature today. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's a great point. This is what I'm thinking, though. The way the media went after him, sort of the fact-checking, what's your proof that DEI had anything to do with this, on and on and on. Trump is known to float these trial balloons, and I'm just trying to play this out. As oftentimes I think he's not given credit, perhaps, for how much he will chum the waters, not just because he wants to be provocative, but because he has a plan.
Well, I'd be speculating because he didn't tell me the reason. But I think you've seen as a through line of the entire administration, just over a week old, they want to play on the notion that the government's incompetent. And they want to play on that notion in a race-freighted way and in an anti-PC way because they want to make big change. And people like government programs, but the polls suggest they don't much like government workers. They think there are too many of them. And so to the extent I see a strategy here, it's to say this is a tragedy. This kind of tragedy happens because we have incompetence fueled by DEI. And not only do we need to fix that at the FAA and with the air traffic controllers, we need to fix it across the board. That's certainly, if not his intention, it certainly will have land that way for tens of millions of Americans.
Mark, obviously, you and I talked a lot about whether Pete Hegseth would get confirmed, extraordinarily controversial, and as you pointed out today, I think purported himself pretty well in terms of how things were sort of rolled out from the time of the crash until today was an extraordinary amount of information about what was happening and delivered cohesively. Today was hearings for Kash Patel for FBI director. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. had a second set of hearings for Secretary of Health and Human Services, and Tulsi Gabbard for Director of National Intelligence. Any one of those three would have been a huge story for Democrats to make a big deal out of each one of their qualifications. Does the way this administration is handling this crisis strengthen Donald Trump's hand, not only in terms of court of public opinion, but with Republicans in the Senate over these three nominees?
Well, it does with Republicans because they've started to make the argument. You heard Tom Cotton, the chairman of Intelligence Committee, make it today, that now it's time to get these folks confirmed. That it was only because Secretary Duffy was confirmed for Treasury that there was a Treasury Secretary in place. They say we need these folks in place. Don't dilly-dally any longer. I think that the lack of spotlight on the hearings probably also works to his favor because the pressure is coming from MAGA, which is not distracted by anything, to demand these folks be confirmed. And that happens more under the radar now because most people in the news business are focused on the tragic crash.
Yeah, for sure. Dominated things today, as well it should. Just sort of how shocking it is. Mark, thank you. As always, we first wrote about this, all of the crash in War Notes. That's our daily newsletter. Comes out just after 4 p.m. Insight and analysis on the top stories of the day. Subscribe for free. You go to warnotes.com. We'll also see you on social media. And this was the opening to War Notes because I think it is important to note. my apartment, I'm standing on my balcony, overlooks Reagan Airport. That's right there. We watch the planes take off and land all day and night. I'm standing on the balcony, and the helicopter route 1 that the helicopter was flying is right here. 2 minutes before the crash, the Black Hawk flew past. So I often am able to wave at the pilots. And last night, about 10 minutes after the crash, I noticed that the steady stream of flights in and out had stopped, and we saw dozens of emergency lights streaming towards the end of the runway. They all congregated right down there. You could see a row of about 100 ambulances lined up in 20 or 30 minutes. And then they all left empty, without people to save. So what happened right before the crash, 350 feet, seconds from landing? The pilots were obviously busy getting ready to land. Passengers, and I've done this myself, would have had their cell phones out. You can get service. And I can't stop thinking about how many times I have texted Rachel, my fiance, while landing at DCA. I'd send a text. Just landing, see you in a few minutes, love you. I could see the apartment. And as we've noted, this is the first major air disaster in 16 years. That text message that is so routine for so many of us to send is the last text message that a number of families now have from their loved one. They thought everything was going to be okay. And that brings us to this. For a whole generation of young Americans, everything has always been okay. Every plane that takes off always lands. The idea that one would not land, a crash of an American jet, an American Airlines jet, is unthinkable. And now there's parents and grandparents trying to explain that to their kids, to their families, of how do you get on a plane now? Dr. Gail Saltz is Clinical Associate Professor of Psychiatry at Weill Cornell Medical Center and joins us now. Gail, it's good to see you, as always. How do you explain to kids, any kid, who for all times has known that you get on a plane, takes off, and it lands, that sometimes they don't?
I think it depends on the age of the child. If you have a very young child who's not going to hear about this some other way, frankly, I wouldn't discuss this. But if you have an older child who probably is, then I actually would make a point of doing so. You want them to be able to ask you questions about it, etc. But I think it's really important to give children the perspective so that you don't make them anxious, that this remains an incredibly rare event. That we do things all the time. We get in cars, we cross the street, we go out in a thunderstorm where there are risks. This risk is incredibly, incredibly low. And partially I say that to say to the child, but I also say that as an adult to say to yourself. You know, it's 1 in 13.6 million, as opposed to a car where it's more like 1 in 100, or even lightning where it's more like 1 in 15,000. So this remains incredibly rare.
So why
have to deal with uncertainty?
Yeah.
A tiny amount.
Yeah, I think, look, it's a great point, how rare it is, but yet it's something that people are still so scared of. And I think it's because you have so little control over it.
Yes.
One thing that we wanted to bring up, obviously, is the victims themselves. We don't have all of their names. We know about a couple of figure skaters. We also know about the pilots. And you find this among especially the pilots who fly the regional jets, just how much they love flying and have loved it their whole lives. Chris Cuomo will have a full interview with the father of one of the pilots, the first officer, and talk to him about his love of aviation and growing up. Take a listen.
How are you making this make sense that someone in the prime of their lives doing everything right is now gone?
It doesn't make sense. The only thing, Sam's right with Jesus, and I know where he's going, and I just love that kid, and I'm sorry.
Well,
full interview
Leland,
coming up with Chris.
The most affected people are the people that lost loved ones, and they will need help. They will need treatment. It will be a very difficult process.
Gail, thank you very much for your perspective. And I think you're right about a lot of people have to have those conversations. Appreciate it. Flying a helicopter a couple of hundred feet. Remember, that's the altitude they were supposed to be at, above a river in a densely populated area, right here, literally, is an incredibly hard thing to do. how night vision goggles, what you're looking at right now, might have made things more dangerous.
Training of night flights on a standard corridor for a continuity of government mission. The military does dangerous things. It does routine things on the regular basis.
In other words, when dangerous things are the routine, occasionally bad things happen. Continuity of government is the mission to evacuate top government and military leaders in times of war. To make flying safer, often military helicopter pilots wear night vision goggles, which are great to avoid power lines and buildings, but often cost pilots their depth perception. Congressman Mark Green is here with us, former flight surgeon for the U.S. Army's Night Stalkers. Spent a lot of time in Blackhawks with night vision.
Yeah.
How much does it help, and what are the dangers?
Clearly, in an urban environment, you get lots of other lights. Somebody can shine a light at you and flash
landing lights of planes coming at you?
It's possible, but it's going to light up really brightly. I mean, if the NVGs are on, you should see those lights, and especially moving lights, right? That's a big difference than a fixed light on a building. What's happening is the helicopters going down here, that they could lose situational awareness to the point that they wouldn't see this plane coming down. Another plane. Honestly, and I've investigated crashes before where target fixation was the issue. They get their eyes locked on one other thing and they miss the thing in their periphery. That does happen, especially, in this aircraft, they only had one crew chief. So that means, the aircraft that I flew in had two, one on each side. And those crew chief are literally outside the aircraft, especially in a situation where they're this low. The regular Army, they fly with one. And so that's two people on one side, one person on the other side. It'd be very interesting to find out which side of the aircraft that crew chief was on.
So we're watching file video. This is what it looks like to look through night vision goggles. So you get a sense of how, to the normal eye, shades of green, and how disoriented it is. The other thing that has come up, and I think we talked about priorities a lot, is the amount of air traffic coming into DCA. It has been expanded greatly. Congress has kept authorizing more and more and more flights, despite some serious questions, including now all of a sudden using intersecting runways. Is this a wake-up call that, yes, aviation's been very safe for very long, but maybe we've gotten complacent?
Well, clearly some issues with the FAA. There's complacency. You talked about that earlier in your show. However, I think the radar systems that are here, the technology on these aircraft, when they work right, we haven't had an accident in a very long time. And those aircraft, you see the helicopters flying up and down the Potomac all the time. These guys need to do this mission because, quite frankly, that unit at Fort Belvoir may have to respond to a disaster inside the city. So they just need to make sure everybody does their job well. And the equipment works.
And staffed well. One air traffic controller rather than two.
Yeah, that's right.
All right.
Thanks.
Good to see you, Congressman. Thank you very much. 13 trillion miles. 13 trillion miles. That's 2 light years. It's also how far U.S. airlines flew passengers since the last fatal plane crash in America. Why flying's actually so safe, but we all feel so scared when we come back. Unquestionably, a number of things went horribly wrong last night to bring us where we are today. And there was an understaffed control tower we know of. Clearly, there was some problem with the pilots in the helicopter that they missed seeing the American Airlines plane. But it is incredible to think about just how long it's been since we had to talk about things like this. The last major commercial crash in the United States was 2009, a Buffalo flight. All 49 people on board died, along with one person on the ground. That was because of weather. But since then, the United States has had over 150 million commercial airlines flights, and there's not been a major crash. Passengers have traveled more than 13 trillion miles. A light year, the distance light travels in 1 year, that is 2 light years. It's not an accident. Lotney Campbell is one of the most experienced commercial airline and military captains in the world and joins us now. Why, yes, flying is scary at points, but why is it so safe?
It's a dedicated thing. We've knocked down a lot of pegs over the years, studying accidents, actually, and incidents. And then the airlines are very good at taking quantitative data every day from every flight and trying to find out what's next, what's going to happen next, how are we going to mitigate the risk that we see, and certainly after an accident, trying to change our protocols so that we can continue to provide such an incredibly safe way of traveling.
Yeah, it's certainly safer than being in a car, oftentimes safer than playing golf because you can get hit by lightning playing golf. Air travel is incredibly safe. The question would then be, have we become complacent?
I don't think it's complacency. I think it's a little bit of human nature. The expectation is perfect. There is no way to fly a perfect airline system or a perfect boating system, yachting system, anything, shipping system, as we saw in Baltimore. Things are going to happen. Now, when you go 14 years with only 49 fatalities in one incident, that your odds of dying are in 5.5 people per year compared to 703,000 that die of heart attacks, or 44,000 dying every year in car crashes, or say 4,500 people dying. Right, but
the number of close calls, the number of runway incursions, the number of go-arounds, all these numbers are going up. Isn't there some thought that at some point you roll the dice enough, something's going to go wrong?
Yes, I think this accident was trending because of the demand and volume of flying that's going on in ever tighter airspace. So we're just going to have to take a look at it. That's the key lesson, is where can we mitigate this? And by the way, Reagan National is not the only place. There's places like Burbank or, say, LaGuardia. If you fly a lot, especially if you're a domestic pilot, I'm an international pilot now, but I did that for 10 years out of Reagan on the 737. So I was very familiar with the pace and the amount of traffic and the rate at which communications have to happen to make that all safely happen. So it's difficult. And we're going to have to take a look at it.
We gotta run, and you're right. We will take a very hard look at it. Captain Campbell, thank you very much. Chris Cuomo with the father of the captain of the American Airlines plane.